The year is 1287, and the horizon of southern Poland is an endless rolling wave of black smoke and screaming iron. For 50 years, the Mongol Empire has been an inescapable natural disaster, a force of nature that doesn't just defeat armies, it erases civilizations. They had already burned Kraków to the ground twice. They had turned the legendary knights of Europe into piles of headless corpses at Legnica. To the medieval world, the Mongols weren't men. They were the scourge of God, and they were invincible. But as Talabuga Khan looks up at the towering, jagged skyline of Kraków, he realizes something is wrong. The wooden palisades he was promised are gone. In their place stands a nightmare of cold, gray stone walls, so thick and sophisticated they seem to defy the very physics of nomadic warfare. This is the moment the myth of Mongol invincibility began to bleed. Down in the mud of the Polish trenches, Duke Leszek the Black isn't praying for a miracle. He is counting on a trap. For decades, Poland had been a land of timber and vulnerability. But in the shadows of their previous defeats, a silent, architectural revolution had taken place. Every village burned, and every church looted in the past had been a lesson bought in blood. Now, the Poles aren't just fighting for survival. They are executing a cold, calculated master plan to turn the Mongols' greatest strengths into their ultimate executioner. By the time the winter of 1288 settles over the Vistula River, thousands of Mongol warriors' men who had conquered from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Germany will be trapped in a freezing, vertical labyrinth of stone and steel. Their horses are starving, their siege engines are useless, and most lethally, the two Khans leading the invasion, Talabuga and the terrifying Nogai, are beginning to turn their blades on each other. How did a nation that had been decimated twice before suddenly become the graveyard of the Golden Horde? How did the Polish transition from wood to stone fundamentally break the Mongol war machine? And what happened in the dark forests of Łagów that was so humiliating, so total in its destruction, that the Mongol Empire, the greatest land empire in human history, would never dare to launch a major invasion of Poland ever again? The Mongol tide was supposed to swallow Europe whole. Instead, it hit a wall, and what happened next would rewrite the rules of medieval warfare forever. For decades, the world lived in the shadow of a single, terrifying truth. The Mongol Empire did not lose. From the shores of the Pacific to the heart of Europe, the descendants of Genghis Khan had perfected the art of total annihilation. They weren't just an army, they were a force of nature, a scourge of God that turned ancient cities into graveyards and entire empires into mere footnotes. Poland knew this terror better than most. In 1241, and again in 1259, the Mongol tide had swept across the Polish plains, leaving behind nothing but smoke and bone. By 1287, as the Golden Horde began to mobilize for a third great raid, the rest of Europe braced for the inevitable. The script was already written. The Polish knights would fall, the wooden palisades would burn, and the road to the west would once again be paved in blood. But as the great Khan's riders crossed the border, they realized the world had changed. The Mongols were about to ride into a nightmare they never saw coming. Instead of a helpless victim, they found a nation that had spent 20 years evolving in the darkness. The wooden walls that once crumbled under Mongol fire were gone, replaced by a silent, gray revolution of stone. The fractured duchies that once fought each other were now led by men like Leszek II, the black leaders who had studied the Mongol way of war, analyzed its rhythms, and finally found its breaking point. This is the story of the 1288 invasion, the forgotten campaign that shattered the Mongol aura of invincibility forever. In this deep dive, we are exploring a masterclass of medieval survival and strategic adaptation. We will analyze how the Siege of Kraków became a humiliating stalemate for the invaders, why the bitter internal rivalries between the legendary Nogai Khan and Talabuga turned a conquest into a catastrophe, and how the brutal Battle of Łagów proved that even the world's most terrifying war machine could be bled dry. How did a nation that had been twice destroyed manage to set a trap so lethal that the Mongols would never dare to launch a full-scale invasion of Poland again? From the evolution of stone fortifications to the critical, high-stakes alliance with Hungary, we are breaking down the tactics that turned Mongol strengths into fatal weaknesses. This wasn't just a defense. It was the moment the stone wall strategy redefined the borders of European history. Today, we reveal how Poland stopped the unstoppable. Welcome to the untold story of the 1288 Mongol trap. Buak II, Khoigoy, and Jiaosu, Pan 1. To understand why 1288 was different, you first have to understand the sheer soul-crushing trauma of what came before. For the average person living in Central Europe in the 13th century, the Mongols weren't just an enemy army. They were a biological phenomenon, a plague of horse and steel that arrived without warning and left nothing but silence. In 1241, the first Mongol invasion hadn't just defeated the Polish, it had dismantled them. At the Battle of Legnica, the flower of European chivalry, the high-born knights in their shining hauberks, were slaughtered so efficiently that the Mongols reportedly filled 9 large sacks with the severed right ears of their victims. The message was clear: your armor is a cage, your bravery is an illusion, and your God is silent. When they returned in 1259, it was more of the same. Kraków was a charred skeleton. The countryside was a wasteland. By the time 1287 rolled around, the Polish people lived with a kind of generational PTSD. The sound of a distant hoofbeat wasn't just a traveler. It was a heartbeat of dread. For 50 years, the logic of the world was simple. The Mongols demand, and you lose. They arrive, and you burn. There was no defense. There was only the hope that they would kill you quickly, or that you could hide deep enough in the forests to starve in peace. But beneath this surface of despair, something was shifting. You see, the Mongols had a type. Their entire war machine was a masterpiece of kinetic energy. They were designed to fight on the open steppe, to exploit the vulnerabilities of wooden palisades, and to feast on the disorganized panic of divided feudal lords. If you gave a Mongol commander a wooden wall, he would give you a bonfire. If you gave him a divided nobility, he would give you a massacre. And for decades, Poland had provided exactly that. But following the second invasion, the Polish survivors, led by men who had lost everything, began to realize that their traditional way of life was essentially a suicide pact. The old Polish defensive strategy was based on grods, fortified settlements made of earth and timber. To a Mongol engineer, a wooden wall wasn't a fortification, it was fuel. Their Chinese-engineered siege engines could turn a wooden gate into toothpicks in an afternoon, and their flaming arrows did the rest. This realization sparked what historians call the Stone Revolution. It wasn't a sudden burst of wealth. It was an act of extreme, desperate sacrifice. Building in stone was catastrophically expensive. It required skilled labor, massive logistics, and a central authority that didn't exist in the fragmented Polish duchies. Yet, Duke Leszek the Black and his predecessors began to funnel every copper coin, every spare bit of labor, and every ounce of political will into a single, obsessive goal. Stop building with trees. Start building with mountains. By 1287, the skyline of southern Poland had transformed. Where there used to be timber fences, there were now jagged gray teeth of limestone and brick. These weren't just walls, they were psychological weapons. They were built with narrow killing zones, reinforced gates, and most importantly, they were designed to be Mongol-proof. The Poles weren't just guessing, they were studying. They looked at the ruins of their grandfathers' homes and asked, how exactly did the fire start? Then, they built walls that couldn't burn. But it wasn't just the architecture that changed. The very DNA of the Polish military was being rewritten. They realized that trying to outmaneuver the Mongol horse archer on an open field was like trying to outswim a shark. It was a loser's game. So, they stopped trying. They began to embrace a vertical style of warfare. If the Mongols owned the horizontal plane, the fields and the plains the Poles would own the vertical one. They would fight from the battlements, from the towers, and from the narrow claustrophobic streets where a horse was a liability, not an asset. When Talabuga Khan and the legendary Nogai Khan mobilized their forces for the 1287-1288 campaign, they were following the old playbook. They brought 30,000 riders, a force capable of flattening a kingdom. They brought the terror of their name. They expected to find the same Poland they had broken twice before, a land of wooden villages and terrified peasants. They expected a sprint. They expected a harvest of gold and slaves. The Mongol intelligence network, usually the best in the world, had failed to account for the sheer scale of the Polish transformation. They knew there were new walls, sure, but they underestimated the will behind those walls. They didn't realize that Leszek the Black had spent his reign consolidating power, not just to rule, but to survive. He had managed to do the impossible. He had convinced the fractured Polish nobility that their internal petty squabbles were a luxury they could no longer afford. For the first time in a century, the Mongols weren't facing a dozen quarreling cousins. They were facing a unified, embittered, and highly prepared state. As the winter of 1287 tightened its grip, the two Mongol columns crossed the border. The northern force, under Talabuga, moved toward Sandomierz and Kraków. The southern force, under Nogai, moved toward the heart of the Polish highlands. They burned the outskirts. They took the easy loot. They rode with the arrogance of gods who had never known a true peer. But as Talabuga's vanguard reached the gates of Kraków, the arrogance began to flicker. The city they saw wasn't the city their fathers had burned. It was a fortress. The stone walls loomed over the Mongol riders, cold and indifferent to their presence. There were no wooden gates to torch. There were no panicked defenders rushing out to meet them in a suicidal charge. Instead, there was a deafening silence from the battlements, broken only by the occasional rhythmic thrum of a heavy crossbow. For the first time in the history of their western expansion, the Mongols weren't looking at a target. They were looking at a puzzle made of 6-foot thick stone that didn't care about their arrows, didn't care about their horses, and most importantly, didn't care about their fear. The Mongols had always been the masters of the calculated nightmare. They used speed and violence to break the enemy's mind before they ever broke their body. But you can't scare a stone wall. And you can't starve a city that has spent a decade stockpiling for exactly this moment. As the weeks dragged on and the legendary Mongol supply lines began to strain against the brutal Polish winter, a terrifying realization began to settle over the Mongol camp. They had been lured into a landscape that was no longer built for people, it was built for their destruction. Talabuga Khan looked at his starving horses and his shivering men, then back at the silent gray walls of Kraków. He realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't the hunter. The Mongols had spent centuries perfecting the art of the Scythian retreat, feigning a flight to lure their enemies into a trap. It was their signature move, the tactic that had destroyed empires from China to Persia. They were the masters of the trap. They were the ones who dictated where and when a battle would happen. But as the first snows of 1288 began to fall, the Mongol commanders looked at the stone wall strategy and realized something that chilled them more than the winter wind. They weren't being blocked. They weren't being held back. The Poles hadn't built these fortresses just to keep the Mongols out. They had built them to keep the Mongols in. The entire kingdom of southern Poland hadn't been fortified. It had been terraformed into a giant, lethal, multi-layered kill box. The Mongols hadn't invaded Poland. They had just walked into the largest, most sophisticated ambush in human history. To truly understand why 1288 wasn't just another massacre, you have to look into the eyes of a Polish defender in the mid-13th century. For 50 years, the very word Mongol wasn't a name for an enemy. It was a synonym for the apocalypse. To the medieval mind, these weren't men from the east. They were the Tartars, a name derived from Tartarus, the deepest abyss of hell. The trauma was biological. In the first invasion of 1241, the Mongols didn't just defeat the Polish armies. They systematically dismantled the concept of European safety. At the Battle of Legnica, the Mongols introduced Europe to a level of psychological warfare they were fundamentally unprepared for. They used smoke screens to divide the knightly ranks. They used whistling arrows that sounded like screaming demons to spook the horses. And when the dust settled, they didn't just take prisoners. They gathered 9 massive sacks filled with the severed right ears of the fallen. It was a tally of total submission. By the second invasion in 1259, the Scourge of God had become a predictable, recurring nightmare. Every 2 decades, like a clockwork of blood, the horizon would turn black with smoke. The Polish grods, the traditional fortified settlements built from the vast, ancient forests of the Vistula, were effectively funeral pyres. A Mongol siege engineer, often conscripted from the captured genius of Imperial China, looked at a wooden wall and saw nothing but fuel. They used traction trebuchets to rain fire and heavy stones, turning these wooden refugees into ovens within hours. For the survivors of 1259, the lesson was written in ash. If Poland remained a land of wood, it would cease to be a land of people. This realization triggered the Stone Revolution, one of the most desperate and expensive architectural pivots in human history. You have to realize that in the 1200s, building in stone wasn't just a design choice. It was the medieval equivalent of a space program. It required specialized masons, massive logistics to haul limestone and granite across roadless marshes, and, most importantly, a staggering amount of capital that the fractured Polish duchies simply didn't have. Yet, under the shadow of the Golden Horde, the impossible began to happen. Duke Leszek the Black, a man often overlooked by history, but arguably the architect of Western survival, realized that the Mongol war machine relied on 2 things: mobility and terror. If you met them in the field, you died. If you hid behind wood, you burned. The only variable left was the earth itself. The Poles began to mine the very foundations of their land. They didn't just build walls, they built vertical labyrinths. They abandoned the sprawling horizontal layouts of the old wooden forts and started building upward. Narrower footprints, thicker bases, and stone that was specifically quarried to resist the impact of siege engines. They created killing zones, bottlenecked entries where the Mongol horseman, the master of the open steppe, would be forced to dismount and fight in claustrophobic, stone corridors where his bow was useless and his mobility was a memory. But this wasn't just about rocks and mortar. It was about a fundamental shift in the Polish soul. For a century, the Polish nobility had been a chaotic mess of bickering cousins, more interested in stealing each other's cattle than defending the borders. But the Mongols were a great equalizer. The stone wall strategy required a level of political unity that had eluded Poland for generations. You couldn't build a fortress network if your neighbor was planning to betray you to the Khan. Leszek the Black used the threat of the Horde as a hammer to forge a unified state, convincing the lords that a crown of stone was better than a grave of ash. As 1287 approached, the Mongol intelligence network, the YAM system, which was arguably the most efficient communication web in the world, knew that Poland was changing. But they were victims of their own success. The Mongol commanders, Talabuga and Nogai, were living in the shadow of giants. Talabuga was the Khan, seeking to prove he was a worthy heir to Genghis. Nogai, however, was the kingmaker, the terrifying warlord who had spent decades dominating the Black Sea region. Their relationship was a toxic cocktail of professional jealousy and lethal ambition. They didn't just want to conquer Poland. They wanted to outshine each other. In their eyes, the reports of stone walls were an inconvenience, not a deterrent. They had breached the Great Wall of China. They had leveled the Grand Walls of Baghdad. They had turned the unconquerable fortresses of the assassins into rubble. Why would a few towers in a backwater like Kraków be any different? They mobilized a force of 30,000 riders. This wasn't just a raiding party. It was a mobile city of destruction. They brought the Hurdu, the massive tent cities that allowed the Mongols to maintain a siege even in the dead of winter. They brought the composite bows that could outrange any European longbow. And they brought the unwavering belief that the world belonged to the horse. In December 1287, the Mongol tide split into two massive columns. The northern column, led by Talabuga, aimed for the heart of the Polish administration, Sandomierz and Kraków. They expected to find the same panic, the same wooden barricades, and the same easy plunder they had enjoyed 30 years prior. But as the first Mongol scouts crested the hills overlooking the Vistula River, the atmosphere changed. The horizon wasn't glowing with the fires of panicked villages. Instead, the countryside was eerily empty. The peasants hadn't fled into the woods to be hunted down. They had vanished behind the gray, jagged teeth of the new stone fortresses. The Mongols, who lived and died by the prey they could capture for food and information, found themselves in a ghost land. Then, they saw Kraków. It wasn't the city of 1259. It was a nightmare of masonry. The high, thick walls of the Wawel castle loomed like a silent challenge. There were no wooden gates to torch. There were no weak points visible to the naked eye. And for the first time in their history, the Mongol vanguard felt a sensation they hadn't experienced in generations: doubt. They attempted their signature move. They rode in circles, shouting insults, raining arrows upon the battlements, trying to goad the Polish knights into a Scythian retreat or a suicidal charge. They expected the hot-headed European chivalry to come charging out to protect their honor. But the Poles didn't move. They sat on the walls, cold and silent. They had learned the hardest lesson of all, that honor is found in survival, not in a brave death. Every time a Mongol rider got too close, a heavy mechanical thrum would echo from the towers, and a massive crossbow bolt designed specifically to punch through the toughest lamellar armor would claim a life with surgical precision. The Mongols were used to a war of movement, a war of the flow. But here, the flow hit a dam. For weeks, Talabuga's army sat in the freezing mud, watching their horses starve because the Poles had burned every scrap of forage before retreating behind their walls. The stone wall strategy wasn't just about defense. It was a strategy of starvation. The Mongols were the ultimate predators, but a predator that cannot reach its prey eventually begins to look at its own pack. As the winter of 1288 deepened, the tension between Talabuga and Nogai reached a breaking point. Talabuga was failing in the north, and he knew that if he returned to the steppe empty-handed, Nogai would use that failure to strip him of his power. But here is the detail that history often skips, the one fact that turns this entire invasion on its head. The Mongols knew about the stone. They saw the walls, and they chose to attack anyway, not because they were arrogant, but because they were desperate. The Golden Horde wasn't just an empire, it was a Ponzi scheme of conquest. If they stopped moving, if they stopped looting, the entire system would collapse under its own weight. They had to break the stone. But as the first major assault on Kraków began, the Mongols realized they hadn't just walked into a fortress, they had walked into a laboratory of death. The stone trap was about to spring, and the world's most terrifying war machine was about to discover that in the new era of warfare, the horse was no longer king. In fact, the very horses that had conquered half the planet were about to become the Mongols' greatest liability. Because in the frozen labyrinth of the Polish winter, there is only one thing more dangerous than a stone wall, a hungry ally with a sharper knife than yours. The traction trebuchets fired. For a century, the sound of a Mongol siege engine was the death knell of cities. Boulders the size of anvils slammed into the walls of Kraków. But there was no splintering of wood, no roaring fires, just the dull, heavy thud of rock against limestone. The walls didn't even flinch. Talabuga Khan threw everything he had at the defenses. He commanded his engineers to dig sapper trenches. The frozen Polish earth broke their tools. He ordered flaming naphtha to be hurled over the battlements. It burned harmlessly against cold, unyielding stone. The Mongol Playbook, perfected over thousands of miles of conquest, was suddenly useless. And then, the Polish defenders answered back, not with panicked screams, but with the terrifying mechanical snap of heavy crossbows. These weren't standard bows. These were windlass cranked monsters designed to punch a steel bolt through a knight's breastplate at 100 yards. To the lamellar armor of a Mongol rider, it was like paper. Within days, the killing zones outside Krakow's walls were choked with dead horses and bleeding men. Talabuga realized he was losing his most valuable asset, momentum. But to pull back meant looking weak. And in the brutal politics of the Golden Horde, weakness was a death sentence. He needed food. He needed plunder. So he made the exact mistake Duke Leszek the Black was praying for. Talabuga broke his army apart. Desperate to feed his starving camp, the Khan sent massive raiding parties north, deep into the Holy Cross Mountains, toward the town of Łagów. He figured if he couldn't take the capital, he would bleed the countryside. But the countryside was waiting. The Mongols rode into the deep, dark forests of Łagów expecting to find terrified peasants hiding in the brush. Instead, they rode into a meticulously designed geographical trap. The dense, ancient pines and narrow, snow-choked ravines stripped the Mongols of the one thing that made them invincible: open space. You can't execute a feigned retreat when there's nowhere to run. You can't shoot a composite bow with deadly accuracy when your fingers are frostbitten and your horse is sinking chest-deep in snowdrifts. And out of the tree line, the nightmare of the Mongols finally arrived. Polish heavy cavalry. For 50 years, the knights of Europe had been slaughtered because they chased the Mongols across open plains. Not this time. At Łagów, the Polish heavy cavalry didn't charge blindly. They ambushed. Clad in mail and wielding heavy lances, they slammed into the fragmented Mongol columns in tight, claustrophobic valleys. It wasn't a battle. It was a butchery. Without room to maneuver, the lightly armored Mongol horse archers were crushed under the hooves of the massive European destriers. The Polish swordsmen cut them down in the snow, leaving thousands of the Great Khan's elite warriors bleeding out in the frozen mud. For the first time, a Mongol column hadn't just been repelled, it had been annihilated. When the survivors limped back to Talabuga's camp outside Kraków, the psychological shock was paralyzing. The hunters had become the hunted. But Talabuga still had a glimmer of hope. He wasn't the only Mongol commander in Poland. Down south, the legendary Nogai Khan, the warlord who had spent his life crushing European armies, was supposed to be sweeping through the highlands. Surely Nogai was bringing a wave of gold, slaves, and food. He wasn't. In fact, Nogai was walking right into a meat grinder of his own. Nogai had driven his southern column toward the fortified town of Stary Sącz. He expected a quick siege, a rapid sack, and a glorious return to the steppe. But just like Talabuga, he hit a wall. Stary Sącz had been reinforced. The defenders were dug in. Nogai's forces set up camp, intending to starve the city out. But Nogai forgot the most critical rule of the new Polish strategy. Leszek the Black hadn't just built walls, he had built alliances. While the Mongols were freezing outside the gates, Leszek was hundreds of miles away in Hungary, cashing in the diplomatic chips he had spent years hoarding. He convinced the Hungarian king that if Poland fell, Hungary was next. Suddenly, the Mongol perimeter at Stary Sącz wasn't a siege camp anymore. It was a target. A massive relief force of Polish and Hungarian knights descended from the Carpathian Mountains. They didn't announce themselves with horns. They struck like a thunderbolt. They caught Nogai's forces completely by surprise, pinned against the very walls they were trying to breach. The legendary Mongol mobility was gone. Trapped between the impregnable stone of Stary Sącz and a charging wall of Polish-Hungarian steel, Nogai's army shattered. The slaughter was absolute. Mongol veterans who had survived campaigns from the Caucasus to the Baltic were hacked to pieces in the shadow of the Polish mountains. Nogai Khan, the terrifying kingmaker of the Golden Horde, was forced to do the unthinkable. He ran. By late January 1288, the grand invasion was officially a catastrophic failure. The two great Mongol columns were starving, bleeding, and freezing. But the Polish trap had one final, cruel mechanism left to spring: the retreat. The Mongols had to cross the Carpathian foothills in the dead of winter to get home. Their horses, the legendary steppe ponies that had carried them across the known world, were dying by the thousands. The Poles had burned the fields so thoroughly that the horses couldn't even dig through the ice for dead grass. Without horses, the Mongols were just men carrying heavy loot in the freezing snow. So, they started dropping the loot. Then, they started dropping their weapons. And that's when the Polish Highlanders, the fierce, axe-wielding mountaineers who knew every cave and cliff, descended from the peaks. They didn't fight formations. They picked the starving Mongols off one by one. They triggered avalanches. They poisoned the few remaining wells. It was a guerrilla war of extermination. As the death toll climbed into the tens of thousands, the final thread holding the Mongol army together snapped. Talabuga and Nogai, humiliated and desperate, finally turned on each other. Talabuga blamed Nogai for failing in the south. Nogai blamed Talabuga for freezing in the north. The hungry ally with a sharper knife had arrived. Instead of fighting their way out of Poland together, the two Mongol factions began skirmishing with each other in the snow. It was the ultimate humiliation. The Polish strategy hadn't just defeated the Mongols physically, it had broken them psychologically. It had turned the greatest unified military machine in human history into a mob of freezing, bickering warlords. When the battered remnants of the Golden Horde finally limped back across the borders, they left behind something far more valuable than the loot they had failed to take. They left behind their aura of invincibility. The myth was dead. The Great Raid of 1287-1288 wasn't just a military defeat. It was a paradigm shift that fundamentally altered the trajectory of European history. Poland had proven that the Mongol war machine had a glaring, fatal flaw. If you took away their mobility, they bled. If you took away their terror, they broke. Leszek the Black didn't live long enough to see the full fruits of his labor, but his stone wall strategy became the blueprint for European survival. The fractured duchies would continue to unify. The walls would continue to rise. The Golden Horde would remain a terror in the east for centuries, exacting tribute and burning cities. But they would never again launch a full-scale, empire-breaking invasion of Poland. The graveyard of Łagów and the silent stone walls of Kraków had taught them a lesson written in Mongol blood. The Mongols had come to erase a kingdom. Instead, they forged a nation of iron and stone. And as the ashes of the failed campaign settled into the frozen Polish earth, the rest of Europe looked to the east and realized a profound, world-changing truth. The scourge of God could bleed, and if it could bleed, it could be killed. To understand how an invincible war machine like the Golden Horde actually breaks, you have to look at the brutal, unforgiving math of starvation. By late December 1287, Talabuga Khan is sitting outside the walls of Kraków, and his logistical spreadsheet is bleeding out. A Mongol army doesn't travel with supply wagons. They travel with herds. Each rider brings 3 to 5 remounts. That's nearly 100,000 horses for the northern column alone. 100,000 animals that need to eat every single day. But Leszek the Black hadn't just built stone walls. He had weaponized the dirt itself. It's a tactic called scorched earth. But the Poles took it to a psychotic extreme. Before retreating behind their new fortifications, they didn't just burn the crops. They burned the grazing fields. They poisoned the wells. They slaughtered whatever livestock they couldn't carry, and left nothing but ash and black ice. Within weeks, the legendary Mongol steppe ponies, the very engine of their empire, began to starve. A starving horse means a grounded Mongol. And a grounded Mongol is just a guy with a bow shivering in a blizzard. Talabuga tries to force the issue. He orders his engineers to bring up the Chinese-designed traction trebuchets. These are the exact same kinetic weapons that had successfully flattened Beijing, Baghdad, and Kiev. They load up massive boulders. They fire. The rocks hit the limestone walls of Wawel Castle, and they bounce off. You see, European stone masonry in the late 13th century had evolved. They weren't just stacking rocks anymore. They were building multi-layered defense matrices. Rubble-filled cores absorbed kinetic impact. It was the medieval equivalent of reactive armor. The Mongol siege engineers, masters of burning wood and collapsing earth, are completely out of their depth. They try digging sap trenches. The Polish ground is frozen solid. Their pickaxes shatter. They try hurling flaming naphtha over the battlements. Cold stone doesn't catch fire. Every day they sit there, the Polish defenders crank back heavy windlass crossbows. Thwack. A 200-pound draw weight, steel bolt punches straight through Mongol lamellar armor at 100 yards. Thwack. Another rider drops in the frozen mud. The Siege of Kraków isn't a siege. It's a slow, agonizing execution. Talabuga knows he's losing control. If he goes back to the steppe with nothing but dead horses and zero loot, Nogai Khan, his bitter rival in the south, will use the failure to have him overthrown. Talabuga needs a win. He needs soft targets. So he makes the exact move Leszek the Black was praying for. Talabuga splits his forces. He sends thousands of his best riders north, deep into the Holy Cross Mountains. Their target, the town of Łagów. He figures if he can't crack the capital, he will bleed the countryside. But Łagów wasn't a soft target. It was a kill box. To get there, the Mongols have to ride into dense, ancient pine forests and narrow, steep ravines. This is the absolute worst terrain on earth for a horse archer. The Mongol way of war relies entirely on the flow, constant, horizontal movement. They need wide open fields to execute their signature feigned retreats and flanking maneuvers. In a mountain ravine, there is no flow. There is only a bottleneck. The Mongol column stretches out into a thin, disorganized line, trudging through chest-deep snowdrifts. Their legendary composite bows, glued together with animal horn and sinew, are starting to delaminate and lose tension in the freezing, wet conditions. The riders are cold, blind, and totally exposed. Then, the tree line explodes. It doesn't start with arrows. It starts with a sound. The deafening, localized earthquake of European heavy cavalry. For 50 years, the Polish knights had been the punchline of the Mongol Empire. They had routinely been lured out into open plains, shot to pieces, and humiliated. But Leszek the Black had completely rewritten the rules of engagement. He told his knights, "Do not chase them. Wait for them to get stuck." And right now, the Mongols are permanently stuck. Hundreds of fully armored Polish destriers' massive war horses, bred specifically for brute force kinetic impact, slam into the flank of the Mongol column. In an open field, the Mongols would have scattered, pivoted, and shot backward. Here, they are crushed against the canyon walls. It's not a battle, it's an industrial slaughter. The heavy lances of the Polish vanguard shatter the Mongol lines on the first impact. Once the charge hits, the knights draw broadswords, maces, and war hammers. In close quarters, claustrophobic melee combat, a heavy knight is a tank, and a light horse archer is unprotected infantry. The northern raiding party is effectively wiped off the map. Thousands of the Great Khan's elite veterans are cut down, their blood freezing in the Polish snow. When the handful of survivors limp back to Talabuga's camp outside Kraków, the psychological shock is absolute. The apex predators of the medieval world didn't just fail, they were butchered, But Talabuga has one desperate, fleeting hope left. Down in the south, the legendary Nogai Khan is operating. Nogai is a warlord who makes kings and breaks empires. He is the terror of the Black Sea. Surely Nogai has cracked the southern highlands and is bringing a massive haul of plunder, food, and slaves to save the campaign. He hasn't. In fact, Nogai is walking right into his own personal nightmare. Nogai had moved his massive southern army toward the fortified town of Stary Sącz. He surrounds it. He sets up the Hurdu, the sprawling Mongol tent city. He thinks he's dictating the pace of the war, settling in to starve the defenders out. But Leszek the Black had been playing four-dimensional chess. Months before the Mongols even crossed the border, Leszek was hundreds of miles away in Hungary. He wasn't begging for help. He was selling a brutal reality check. He looked the Hungarian king, Ladislaus IV, in the eye and laid it out perfectly. If my stone walls fall, your kingdom is next. Hungary had been gutted by the Mongols in 1241. They understood the assignment perfectly. While Nogai is sitting outside Stary Sącz, freezing and staring at stone walls he can't breach, he isn't watching his rear. The Mongol YAM system, the greatest scouting and intelligence network in the world, has gone completely blind, paralyzed by the bitter cold and the Polish guerrilla units hunting their outriders in the dark. Nogai thinks he is the hammer. He's actually the anvil. Without warning, a massive combined arms coalition of Hungarian and Polish heavy cavalry pours out of the Carpathian mountain passes. They don't blow horns. They don't offer terms. They hit the Mongol siege camp with the force of a freight train. Nogai's forces are caught completely off guard. They are violently pinned between the unyielding stone walls of Stary Sącz and a crushing tidal wave of European steel. The iron discipline of the Golden Horde shatters in seconds. Panic rips through the camp. Nogai Khan, the terrifying kingmaker of the steppe, the man who had brought the Byzantine Empire to its knees, is forced to do the unthinkable. He abandons his own men, turns his horse, and runs for his life. The slaughter at Stary Sącz is absolute. The southern Mongol column is completely dismantled. By late January 1288, the grand invasion is dead. Both the northern and southern armies are broken, bleeding, and starving. But the horror for the Mongols is just beginning. They have to get home. They have to march back across the treacherous Carpathian foothills in the dead of winter, and they have almost no horses left. Imagine the scene. Tens of thousands of the most feared warriors on the planet, now reduced to freezing infantry, dragging themselves through waist-deep snow. They start dropping their heavy loot. Then, they drop their armor. Finally, they drop their weapons. It ceases to be a military retreat. It becomes a death march. This is when the trap springs its final, cruelest mechanism. The Polish Highlanders move in. These are the Goral fierce, axe-wielding mountaineers who know every single cave, cliff, and goat path in the region. They don't fight in formations. They fight like ghosts. They trigger massive avalanches onto the retreating Mongol columns, burying hundreds alive in seconds. They poison the few unfrozen streams. They launch midnight raids, slitting throats in the dark and vanishing back into the blizzard before the Mongols can even draw their blades. The invaders are experiencing the terrifying reality of asymmetric guerrilla warfare. They are dying by the thousands, and they can't even see the enemy killing them. And then, the ultimate breakdown happens. Under the crushing pressure of starvation, frostbite, and total humiliation, the two Mongol Khans snap. Talabuga blames Nogai for failing in the south and leaving his flank totally exposed. Nogai blames Talabuga for failing to take Kraków and wasting precious time in the north. The Golden Horde doesn't just retreat, they fracture. The two factions of the exact same army draw swords on each other. In the middle of a freezing, blood-soaked Polish wasteland, Mongol kills Mongol. The greatest, most unified military machine in human history has been systematically reduced to a bickering, bleeding mob of desperate warlords fighting over scraps of food. When the surviving fragments of the Golden Horde finally crawl back across the border into the Rus principalities, they are completely unrecognizable. They didn't conquer. They didn't loot. They barely survived. Talabuga Khan's reputation is irreparably destroyed. The failure is so absolute that within a few years, Nogai will orchestrate his assassination, plunging the Golden Horde into a brutal civil war that will cripple them for a generation. The 1288 invasion was the ultimate breaking point. The Poles had done the impossible. They didn't just survive the Mongols, they reverse-engineered their entire military doctrine. By transitioning from vulnerable wood to impenetrable stone, by deliberately weaponizing the catastrophic winter, and by perfectly timing their heavy cavalry ambushes in claustrophobic terrain, Poland created the ultimate blueprint for destroying the steppe nomad threat. For 50 years, Europe had believed the Mongols were a divine punishment, a literal force of nature you couldn't fight, only endure. But as the smoke cleared over Kraków, and the spring thaw melted the snows to reveal thousands of dead invaders scattered across the valleys, a new reality dawned. The aura of invincibility was gone forever. The Mongols would never again attempt a full-scale, empire-breaking conquest of Poland. The nightmare was over. The Mongols had come to erase a kingdom. Instead, they hit a wall, and the world would never be the same. To truly grasp the sheer mechanical genius of the 1288 trap, you have to look past the swords and focus on the brutal, unforgiving math. By late December, the Golden Horde wasn't just fighting the Polish. They were fighting the laws of physics. A Mongol invasion force was, at its core, a biological engine. 30,000 riders didn't just mean 30,000 mouths to feed. Every Mongol warrior traveled with a string of 3 to 5 remounts to maintain their legendary mobility. That meant Talabuga Khan had brought roughly 100,000 horses into a frozen wasteland. To keep that engine running, those horses needed to consume nearly 2 million pounds of forage every single day. But Leszek the Black hadn't just locked his people behind stone walls, he had weaponized the dirt itself. The Polish scorched earth policy wasn't just a haphazard burning of farms. It was a calculated, systematic erasure of calories. The Poles had burned the pastures, poisoned the shallow wells, and slaughtered the livestock they couldn't fit inside the castles. When the Mongol horses tried to dig through the heavy snow to find winter grass, they found nothing but black ash and solid ice. Within weeks, the biological clock of the Golden Horde hit zero. The steppe ponies, the very foundation of the Mongol Empire's military supremacy, began to starve to death by the thousands. And a grounded Mongol rider is no longer an apex predator. He is just a man shivering in a blizzard. Talabuga Khan knew he was on a timer. To save his army, he needed to break Kraków. He ordered his Chinese-trained siege engineers to step up. For decades, these engineers were the ultimate trump card. They dragged forward the massive traction trebuchets, the exact same kinetic weapons that had successfully flattened the defenses of Beijing, shattered Baghdad, and turned Kiev to dust. They loaded boulders the size of anvils. They calculated the trajectory. They fired. The rocks slammed into the limestone walls of Wawel Castle with a deafening crack, and they bounced off. European military architecture had secretly evolved while the Mongols were away. The Poles weren't just stacking rocks, they were building multi-layered defense matrices. The new walls featured thick, rubble-filled cores sandwiched between heavy limestone blocks. When a trebuchet boulder hit, the rubble inside shifted, absorbing the kinetic impact like medieval reactive armor. The walls didn't shatter. They didn't even crack. They just absorbed the hit. The Mongol engineers, masters of burning wood and collapsing earthen mounds, were completely out of their depth. They tried hurling pots of flaming naphtha over the battlements. But cold, wet stone doesn't burn. They tried digging sapper trenches to undermine the foundations. But the Polish ground was frozen so solid, it shattered their iron pickaxes. The Mongol playbook was suddenly entirely useless. But the Poles weren't just hiding. They were waiting for the Mongols to get frustrated. The Mongols rode close to the walls, screaming insults, performing trick-riding maneuvers, and firing thousands of arrows at the battlements. It was their classic psychological bait. They wanted the hot-headed European knights to lose their temper, open the gates, and charge out into an open field slaughter. The Poles didn't charge, they just cranked their weapons. From the high towers, a terrifying, mechanical snap echoed across the frozen plains. The Polish defenders were armed with heavy, windlass cranked crossbows. These were brutal, industrial weapons with draw weights exceeding 300 pounds. The Mongol composite bow was the machine gun of the 13th century, capable of firing 10 arrows a minute. But the European heavy crossbow was a sniper rifle. A steel-tipped crossbow bolt, fired from those walls, had enough kinetic force to punch cleanly through a knight's steel breastplate at 100 yards. When those bolts hit the Mongol riders, their lamellar armor made of hardened leather and iron scales designed to deflect glancing blows offered zero protection. The bolts tore through them like wet paper. The killing zones outside Kraków quickly choked with dead horses and bleeding veterans. Talabuga Khan was bleeding out, not just in manpower, but in prestige. In the cutthroat political arena of the Golden Horde, a Khan who couldn't deliver plunder was a Khan who wouldn't live to see the summer. He had to pivot. He needed a soft target to feed his men and salvage his reputation. So, he made the exact tactical blunder Leszek the Black had been praying for. Desperate for a win, Talabuga split his army. He sent a massive column of his elite veterans north, plunging deep into the Holy Cross Mountains toward the town of Łagów. If he couldn't crack the capital, he would bleed the countryside dry. But Łagów wasn't a soft target. It was a meticulously designed kill box. To reach the town, the Mongol column had to ride into dense, ancient pine forests and navigate narrow, steep ravines. This was the absolute worst terrain on planet Earth for a horse archer. The entire Mongol way of war relied on the flow, constant, horizontal movement. They needed wide-open plains to execute their signature feigned retreats, flanking maneuvers, and encirclements. In a mountain ravine, there is no flow. There is only a bottleneck. The Mongol riders were forced into a thin, disorganized line, trudging through waist-deep snowdrifts. The temperature plummeted. The animal horn and fish glue used to construct their legendary composite bows began to delaminate and lose tension in the freezing moisture. The riders were cold, blind, and totally exposed. Then, the tree line exploded. It didn't start with a volley of arrows. It started with a localized earthquake. For 50 years, the Polish heavy cavalry had been the punchline of the Mongol Empire. They had been lured out into the open, exhausted, and shot to pieces at Legnica. But this time, they weren't chasing ghosts on an open field. They were waiting at the end of a funnel. Hundreds of fully armored Polish knights, riding massive war horses called destriers, dropped from the tree line and slammed into the flank of the Mongol column. A medieval destrier wasn't just a horse. It was a 1,500-pound biological tank bred specifically for brute force kinetic impact. When they collided with the 600-pound steppe ponies in a tight, claustrophobic valley, it wasn't a battle. It was a medieval car crash. The heavy lances of the Polish vanguard shattered the Mongol lines on the first impact. Without the open space to scatter and regroup, the Mongols were crushed against the canyon walls. Once the charge hit, the knights drew broadswords, maces, and warhammers. In close quarters, melee combat, a heavy knight is impenetrable, and a lightly armored horse archer is dead meat. The northern raiding party was systematically wiped off the map. Thousands of the Great Khan's finest warriors were butchered, their blood turning the Polish snow into a red slush. When the handful of survivors limped back to Talabuga's camp, the psychological shock paralyzed the army. The apex predators had become the prey. But Talabuga still clung to one final hope. Down in the southern highlands, the legendary Nogai Khan was operating. Nogai was the kingmaker, the warlord who made the Byzantine Empire tremble. Surely Nogai had cracked the southern fortresses and was marching north with a massive haul of food and slaves. He wasn't. Nogai Khan was currently trapped in his own personal nightmare. Nogai had pushed his massive southern army to the fortified town of Stary Sącz. He surrounded the city, pitched his sprawling tent camps, and prepared to starve the defenders out. He was confident. He was relaxed. He thought he was dictating the pace of the war. But Nogai was deaf and blind. The Mongol Yam network, the most sophisticated scouting and intelligence system in the medieval world, had completely collapsed. Polish Highlander guerrillas were hunting the Mongol outriders in the dark, cutting their throats, and leaving them in the snow. Nogai wasn't receiving any dispatches. He had no idea what was happening 10 miles away, let alone 100. He didn't know that Leszek the Black had played his ultimate trump card. Months prior, Leszek had traveled to Hungary. He didn't beg for troops. He sold a brutal reality check to the Hungarian king. Hungary had been completely gutted by the Mongols in 1241. Leszek looked the king in the eye and delivered a simple message. If my stone walls fall, your kingdom burns next. The Hungarians understood the assignment. While Nogai sat freezing outside Stary Sącz, the ground behind him began to vibrate. Without warning, a massive combined arms coalition of Hungarian and Polish heavy cavalry poured out of the Carpathian mountain passes. They didn't blow horns to announce a duel. They didn't offer terms of surrender. They hit the Mongol rear with the force of a freight train. Nogai's forces were caught completely off guard. They were violently pinned between the unyielding stone walls of Stary Sącz and a crushing tidal wave of European steel. The iron discipline of the Golden Horde evaporated in seconds. Panic ripped through the camp. The Mongols couldn't run, they couldn't shoot, and they couldn't hide. Nogai Khan, the terrifying kingmaker of the steppe, the man who had spent his life crushing European armies, was forced to do the unthinkable. He abandoned his men, turned his horse, and fled for his life into the woods. The slaughter at Stary Sącz was absolute. The southern Mongol column was entirely dismantled. By late January 1288, the grand invasion was officially dead. Both armies were broken, bleeding, and starving. But the Polish trap had one final, cruel mechanism left to spring. The invaders had to get out. The retreat across the Carpathian foothills became a textbook death march. Without horses, tens of thousands of the most feared warriors on the planet were reduced to freezing infantry, dragging themselves through waist-deep snow. To survive, they started dropping the loot. Then they dropped their heavy armor. Finally, they dropped their weapons. That is when the Górale moved in. The Polish Highlanders, fierce, axe-wielding mountaineers who knew every cave and goat path in the region, descended on the retreating Mongols. They didn't fight in formations. They fought like ghosts. They triggered massive avalanches that buried entire Mongol companies alive in seconds. They launched midnight raids, slitting throats in the dark and vanishing back into the blizzard before the Mongols could even draw their blades. The invaders were experiencing the terrifying reality of asymmetric guerrilla warfare. They were dying by the thousands, and they couldn't even see the enemy killing them. Under the crushing pressure of starvation, frostbite, and total humiliation, the final thread holding the Mongol army together snapped. The two Khans broke. Talabuga blamed Nogai for failing in the south and leaving his flank entirely exposed. Nogai blamed Talabuga for failing to take Kraków and wasting precious time in the freezing north. The paranoia and desperation boiled over. Instead of fighting their way out of Poland together, the two factions of the exact same army drew swords on each other. In the middle of a freezing, blood-soaked Polish wasteland, Mongol killed Mongol. The greatest, most unified military machine in human history was systematically reduced to a bickering, bleeding mob of desperate warlords fighting over scraps of frozen horse meat. When the surviving fragments of the Golden Horde finally crawled back across the border, they were completely unrecognizable. They didn't conquer. They didn't loot. They barely escaped with their lives. The Great Raid of 1288 wasn't just a military defeat. It was the death of a myth. Poland had proven that the Mongol war machine had a glaring, fatal flaw. If you took away their mobility with claustrophobic terrain, they bled. If you neutralized their terror with unyielding stone walls, they broke. If you starved their horses, the scourge of God was just a man. The Mongols had come to erase a kingdom. Instead, they hit a wall, and the rules of medieval warfare were rewritten forever. The winter of 1288 didn't just arrive. It hit the Golden Horde like a physical blow. We are talking about deep, sub-zero temperatures, the kind of bone-snapping cold that causes bowstrings to splinter and freezes blood before it even hits the snow. Inside the Mongol camps outside Kraków, a terrifying, unfamiliar silence takes over. The Mongols are apex predators, entirely used to living off the land. But Leszek the Black hasn't left them a land to live off. He left them a graveyard. Mongol horses are built for extreme endurance, not for starvation. To survive the blinding blizzards, the riders are forced to bleed their own mounts, drinking the hot blood just to stave off hypothermia. It's a desperate survival tactic they've used for centuries on the open steppe. But there's a fatal flaw in doing this during a static siege. A bled horse is a weak horse, and a weak horse can't pull a heavy traction trebuchet. It can't execute a rapid flanking maneuver. It can't charge. By late January, the Mongol war machine is literally cannibalizing its own engine just to survive the night. And the Polish defenders? They know exactly what's happening. Up on the limestone battlements of Wawel Castle, the Poles aren't just surviving. They are watching. They are calculating. Leszek the Black's entire strategy relies on a simple, brutal premise. Let the winter do the heavy lifting, and when the enemy is too frozen to fight, you break their minds. Which brings us to the psychological warfare. For the first time in European history, the roles are about to reverse. For 100 years, the Mongols owned the night. They were the ones who kept besieged cities awake with war drums, screaming arrows, and the relentless terror of the unknown. But Kraków in 1288 is different. As the freezing nights drag on, the heavy oak doors at the base of the fortress silently swing open. Small, elite units of Polish infantry slip out into the darkness. They don't wear heavy, clanking chainmail. They paint their faces with ash. They are armed with short swords, daggers, and a very specific set of orders. They don't attack the main camp. They target the stragglers, the perimeter sentries, the foraging parties. They slit throats in the dark, poison the snowmelt, and vanish back behind the impenetrable stone walls before the Mongol alarm can even be sounded. The psychological toll on the Golden Horde is catastrophic. The greatest hunters on Earth suddenly realize they are being hunted. Talabuga Khan is pacing in his command tent. He is bleeding manpower to the cold, to the crossbows, and to the invisible ghosts slipping out of Kraków. His generals are watching him. In the cutthroat hierarchy of the Mongol Empire, a Khan who projects weakness is a Khan who gets replaced, usually with a knife to the back. He needs a victory, and he is willing to march his men straight into hell to get it. That's when the fatal order is given. The northern column splits. Talabuga takes thousands of his elite veterans, mounts them on their surviving, emaciated horses, and rides north toward the Holy Cross Mountains. Their target is the town of Łagów. Talabuga expects a soft target, a village of terrified peasants he can easily slaughter to boost camp morale and secure food. But Leszek the Black didn't leave soft targets. He left bait. The ride to Łagów is a topographical nightmare. The Mongols are forced into deep, ancient pine forests. The terrain actively funnels them into narrow, snow-choked ravines. The legendary Mongol horse archer requires an average of 100 yards of open space to execute their deadly hit and run tactics. In these mountain ravines, they barely have 10. They are packed shoulder to shoulder. The horses are sinking chest deep in the snowdrifts. The temperature is plunging, and the animal glue holding their composite bows together is actively delaminating in the moisture. They are completely blind to their flanks. And then, the ground begins to shake. It's not an earthquake. It's the sound of 1,500-pound biological tanks closing in at 30 miles per hour. Polish heavy cavalry. For decades, the Mongol playbook was incredibly predictable. Lure the heavy European knights out into the open plain, exhaust their massive horses, and shoot them to pieces from a distance. But the Poles have adapted. They didn't come to the open plain. They waited at the bottom of the funnel. When the Polish destriers hit the Mongol vanguard, the kinetic force is apocalyptic. A heavily armored knight wielding a lance and hitting a stationary freezing steppe pony isn't a battle. It's an execution. The heavy lances shatter the Mongol front line in milliseconds. But the real horror for the Mongols starts after the lances break. The knights draw their secondary weapons: maces, war hammers, broadswords. In a tight, claustrophobic valley, where you physically don't have the space to swing a bow, reach and heavy armor dictate who lives and who dies. The Mongol lamellar armor, expertly designed to deflect arrows from a distance, caves in instantly under the blunt force trauma of European steel war hammers. It is an industrial slaughter. Thousands of elite steppe warriors are hacked to pieces, their blood turning the deep Polish snow into a red slush. And while Talabuga's men are being butchered in the north, the ultimate kingmaker of the Golden Horde is facing his own personal apocalypse in the south. Nogai Khan, the absolute terror of the Black Sea, the warlord who had literally reduced the Byzantine Empire to a frightened vassal state. He is currently besieging the fortified town of Stary Sącz. He thinks he is in total control. His massive tent city surrounds the fortress. His men are dug in. He is calmly starving the defenders out. But Nogai is missing one critical piece of information. The Polish intelligence blackout is complete. The fierce Polish Highlanders haven't just been killing Mongol scouts. They've been blinding the entire southern army. Nogai has no idea that his rear flank is completely exposed. He doesn't know about Leszek the Black's diplomatic masterstroke in Hungary. While Nogai is staring at the stone walls of Stary Sącz, an alliance of Hungarian and Polish heavy cavalry is quietly cresting the Carpathian passes right behind him. They don't send an envoy. They don't issue a challenge. They don't even blow their horns. They hit the Mongol camp like a tidal wave of steel. The shock is absolute. The Mongols are violently pinned against the very stone walls they were trying to breach. The Hungarian knights, holding a deeply personal generational grudge for the destruction of their homeland in 1241, show zero mercy. They burn the Mongol tents. They trample the siege engineers. They cut off the escape routes. Nogai Khan, the undefeated kingmaker, looks at his collapsing army. He realizes the brutal math of the trap. If he stays, he dies. So the man who made empires tremble does the only thing he can. He abandons his army, turns his horse, and runs. The retreat of the Golden Horde in early 1288 becomes one of the most brutal death marches in military history. The grand invasion is over. Now, it's just about survival. Tens of thousands of freezing, starving Mongols are dragging themselves back toward the borders. The horses are dead. They are dropping their gold. They are dropping their armor. They are scavenging the dead. And the Polish aren't going to let them leave quietly. Enter the Goral, the Highlanders of the Carpathians. They don't fight like the knights. They fight like the mountain itself. As the Mongols cross the treacherous icy passes, the Highlanders strike. They trigger massive avalanches that bury entire Mongol companies under hundreds of tons of snow in a matter of seconds. They snipe from the high cliffs with heavy crossbows. They launch midnight raids, killing the remaining horses and vanishing before the Mongols can even draw their swords. The Mongol army is bleeding out from 1,000 invisible cuts. And under this unimaginable pressure, the final, most crucial component of the Mongol war machine completely shatters: their legendary unity. Talabuga and Nogai finally cross paths during the chaotic retreat. There is no camaraderie. There is no shared grief over their fallen men. There is only raw, murderous paranoia. Talabuga points his blade at Nogai, screaming that the southern collapse left his flank entirely exposed. Nogai stares right back, blaming Talabuga for wasting precious time and resources failing to crack Kraków in the north. The Golden Horde doesn't just retreat, they fracture. In the middle of a frozen, blood-soaked wasteland, the unthinkable happens. Mongol draws sword on Mongol. The greatest, most unified military force on the planet devolves into a bickering, bleeding mob. They are fighting each other in the snow for scraps of food, for the last remaining horses, and for survival. The psychological breakdown is complete. When they finally stagger back across the border into the Rus principalities, they aren't an army anymore. They are a warning. Talabuga Khan's prestige is entirely erased. He is humiliated, stripped of his aura of invincibility, Nogai is already actively plotting his revenge. Within 2 years, Nogai will orchestrate a bloody coup, assassinating Talabuga and dragging the Golden Horde into a catastrophic civil war that will completely paralyze their ability to project power into Europe. The 1288 trap didn't just save Poland. It broke the Golden Horde from the inside out. Leszek the Black's strategy is completely vindicated. By transitioning to stone, embracing the vertical battlefield, and weaponizing the very environment, he had achieved the impossible. He had looked the medieval apocalypse in the eye and forced it to blink. The Mongols came to Poland to erase a civilization, but the only thing they erased was their own myth. The strength of the Mongols lay in their flow, a relentless movement, a whirlwind sweeping away all obstacles on a flat plain. But in Poland, in 1288, that flow collided with a new reality, the era of stone walls. The stone walls of Duke Leszek the Black were not merely architectural structures. They were declarations in stone of the resilience of a nation that refused to be erased. The transition from wood to stone, from the chaos of decentralized lords to a unified bloc under the shadow of peril, transformed Poland into a vertical labyrinth where the speed of steppe horses became shackles and the arrogance of the Khans became a death sentence. We have seen the open loops of history grimly closed. The mystery of the collapse at Łagów is no longer an anecdote. It is proof that when the hunter loses spatial superiority, they become the prey. The dense forests and narrow ravines stripped the empire of the skies of its vision, forcing the steppe warriors to fight a war they could not win, a war of weight, of plate armor, and of head-on collisions from the Polish heavy cavalry. The humiliation of Talabuga and the flight of Nogai Khan were not merely military defeats. That was the moment the myth of Mongol invincibility, their most powerful psychological weapon, shattered into 1,000 pieces on the limestone slabs of Kraków. When the Mongols began swinging their swords at their own compatriots in hunger and despair amidst the freezing winter, the core structure of the largest empire in history was fractured. The unity that was the pride of Genghis Khan's descendants melted before the unwavering resolve of a nation that had learned to survive from its own ashes. This is the most satisfying answer to the mystery of 1288. Poland did not stop at defense. They executed a revolution in the mindset of warfare. They understood that to defeat a force of nature, you cannot simply confront it. You must change the very terrain on which it operates. By turning every fortress into a cross-section, cutting through the rising tide, by turning the harsh winter into a strategic ally, and by turning silent sacrifice into a master plan, Poland rewrote its destiny. The Battle of 1288 is not just a milestone in Polish history books. It is a beacon for all of Europe. It proves that the scourge of God can be broken, that the gods of the steppe can also bleed, and that the darkness of annihilation can be pushed back by the light of preparation and bravery. The forests of Łagów and the city walls of Kraków still stand, serving as silent witnesses to the moment a battered nation rose to become the butcher of its own conquerors. When the sun of the spring of 1288 rose over the Vistula River, it not only warmed the weary Polish warriors on the city walls, but also illuminated a new truth for human history. No empire lasts forever. No army is unstoppable when facing the power of a will forged in red fire and recast in hard stone. The great Mongol invasion ended not with a bang of conquest, but with a hiccup of collapse. And from the ruins of that imperial ambition, Poland rose, no longer a victim of history, but the architect of its own future, creating a fortress wall that would never fall to any storm from the east again. When the last remnants of the Golden Horde staggered across the border, leaving behind snowfields stained red with blood and stone fortresses still standing like eternal entities, the medieval world witnessed a great geopolitical shift. The biggest question we asked from the beginning, how a nation that had been trampled twice could become the graveyard for the most battle-hardened army in history, finally had an undeniable answer. It was not just a victory of swords and spears, but a victory of an evolved intellect that transcended the primal instinct of conquest. The strength of the Mongols inherently lay in their flow, a relentless movement, a whirlwind sweeping away all obstacles on the flat plain of the steppe. But in Poland in 1288, that flow collided with a grim new reality, the era of stone walls. The stone walls of Duke Leszek the Black were not merely architectural structures. They were declarations in stone of the resilience of a nation that refused to be erased from the map of humanity. The cruel transition from wood to stone, from the chaos of decentralized lords to a unified bloc under the shadow of peril, transformed Poland into a vertical labyrinth where the divine speed of steppe horses became shackles and the arrogance of the Khans became a death sentence for themselves. We have together closed the loops of history with the most naked truths. The mystery of the collapse at Łagów is no longer a vague anecdote. It is proof that when the hunter loses spatial superiority, they instantly become the prey. The dense forests and narrow ravines of Poland stripped the empire of the skies of its vision, forcing the steppe warriors to fall into a war for which they were never prepared, a war of weight, of plate armor, and of head-on collisions from heavy cavalry, the tanks of flesh and iron of Europe. The humiliation of Talabuga and the cowardly flight of Nogai Khan were not merely tactical military defeats. That was the moment the myth of Mongol invincibility, the most powerful psychological weapon, the dark magic that once subdued both China and Persia, shattered into 1,000 pieces on the cold limestone slabs of the city of Kraków. When the Mongols began swinging their swords at their own compatriots in hunger and despair amidst the winter, the structure of the largest empire in history was fractured from its very core. The unity that was the pride of Genghis Khan's descendants melted like early snow before the unwavering resolve of a nation that had learned to survive from the very ashes of its past. This is the most satisfying answer to the mystery of 1288. Poland did not stop at passive defense. They executed a comprehensive revolution in the mindset of warfare. They understood that to defeat a force of nature, you cannot simply confront it with brute strength. You must change the very terrain and the rules by which it operates. By turning every fortress into a cross-section, cutting through the rising tide, by turning the harsh winter into a strategic ally, and by turning the silent sacrifice of previous generations into a master plan, Poland single-handedly rewrote its own destiny. The Battle of 1288 is not just a milestone in Polish history books. It is a beacon for the entire Western civilization. It proves an eternal truth that the scourge of God can be broken, that the gods of the steppe can also bleed, and that the darkness of annihilation can be pushed back by the light of preparation and extraordinary bravery. The forests in Łagów and the city walls in Kraków still stand, enduring through centuries as silent witnesses to the moment. A battered nation rose to become the butcher of the very ones who came to conquer. When the sun of the spring of 1288 rose over the Vistula River, It not only warmed the weary Polish warriors on the city walls, but also illuminated a new chapter for human history. That truth echoes through time. No empire lasts forever. No army is unstoppable when facing the power of a will forged in red fire and recast in hard stone. The last great Mongol invasion ended not with a bang of conquest, but with a hiccup of total collapse. From the ruins of Eastern imperial ambition, Poland rose, no longer a pitiful victim, but the great architect of its own future, building a fortress wall that would never fall to any storm again. The victory of 1288 was not merely a military milestone. It was an epic of the evolution of a nation's soul. When the last remnants of the Golden Horde staggered across the border, leaving behind snowfields stained red with blood and stone fortresses still standing like eternal entities, the medieval world witnessed a great geopolitical shift. The greatest lesson from the graveyard of this most battle-hardened army in history lies not just in swords and spears, but in an ultimate truth. Adaptation is a weapon sharper than any blade, and a unified will is a fortress wall that can never be penetrated. The strength of the Mongols inherently lay in their flow, a relentless movement, a whirlwind sweeping away all obstacles on the flat plain of the steppe. But in Poland in 1288, that flow collided with the reality of the era of stone walls. The stone walls of Duke Leszek the Black were not merely architecture. They were declarations in stone of the resilience of a nation that refused to be erased. The cruel transition from wood to stone, from the chaos of decentralized lords to a unified bloc under the shadow of peril, transformed Poland into a vertical labyrinth where the divine speed of steppe horses became shackles, and the arrogance of the Khans became a death sentence for themselves. The mystery of the collapse at Łagów or Stary Sącz are no longer vague anecdotes. They are proof that when the hunter loses spatial superiority, they instantly become the prey. The dense forests and narrow ravines stripped the empire of the skies of its vision, forcing the steppe warriors to fall into a war for which they were never prepared. A war of weight, of plate armor, and of head-on collisions from heavy cavalry. The tanks of flesh and iron of Europe. The humiliation of Talabuga and the flight of Nogai Khan was the moment the myth of Mongol invincibility, the most powerful psychological weapon, the dark magic that once subdued both China and Persia, shattered into 1,000 pieces on the cold limestone slabs of the city of Kraków. When the Mongols began swinging their swords at their own compatriots in despair, the structure of the largest empire in history was fractured from its very core. The unity that was the pride of Genghis Khan's descendants melted before the resolve of a nation that had learned to survive from the very ashes of its past. Poland did not stop at passive defense. They executed a revolution in strategic thinking. They proved that to defeat a force of nature, you cannot simply confront it with brute strength. You must change the very terrain and the rules by which it operates. By turning every fortress into a cross-section, cutting through the rising tide, by turning the harsh winter into a strategic ally, Poland single-handedly rewrote its own destiny. The Battle of 1288 stands as a beacon for all of civilization. It proves that the scourge of God can be broken, that the gods of the steppe can also bleed, and that the darkness of annihilation can be pushed back by the light of preparation and extraordinary bravery. The forests in Łagów and the walls in Kraków still stand, acting as silent witnesses to the moment a battered nation rose to become the butcher of its own conquerors. When the sun of the spring of 1288 rose over the Vistula River, it not only warmed the weary warriors, but also illuminated a new chapter for human history. No empire lasts forever. No army is unstoppable when facing the power of a will forged in red fire and recast in hard stone. The last great Mongol invasion ended not with a bang of conquest, but with a hiccup of total collapse. From the ruins of Eastern imperial ambition, Poland rose, no longer a victim, but the great architect of its own future. The victory of 1288 was not merely a military milestone sleeping in the past. It was an epic of the evolution of a nation's soul in adversity. When the last remnants of the Golden Horde staggered across the border, leaving behind snowfields stained red with blood and stone fortresses still standing like eternal entities, the medieval world witnessed a great geopolitical shift. The biggest question we asked from the beginning, how a nation that had been trampled twice could become the graveyard for the most battle-hardened army in history, finally had an undeniable answer. It was not just a victory of swords and spears, but a victory of evolved intellect, transcending the instinct of conquest. The strength of the Mongols inherently lay in their flow, a relentless movement, a whirlwind sweeping away all obstacles on a flat plain. But in Poland in 1288, that flow collided with a new reality, the era of stone walls. The stone walls of Duke Leszek the Black were not merely architectural structures. They were declarations in stone of the resilience of a nation that refused to be erased. The transition from wood to stone, from the chaos of lords to a unified block under the shadow of peril, transformed Poland into a vertical labyrinth where the speed of steppe horses became shackles and the arrogance of the Khans became a death sentence for themselves. If you have stayed until this moment of the story, it proves you are not merely looking for surface-level historical facts, but you are yearning to understand the deep laws that have shaped our world today. The moments when the survival of an entire civilization hung by a thread. In-depth analyses of tactics, psychology, and turning points that shifted the grand scheme like this are exactly the reason our community exists. To continue deciphering blood-soaked lessons from the greatest empires together, hit the subscribe button right now. That is how you ensure the next strategic analyses of classic historical confrontations will appear on your homepage the moment they are released. The stories of the fall of the invincible myth do not stop at the Polish border. The disastrous defeat in 1288 was just the first crack in a chain of catastrophes that would pull down the greatest empire ever to appear on Earth. To better understand how the gods of the steppe single-handedly destroyed Genghis Khan's legacy from the inside, the video appearing on the screen right now will take you to the most brutal civil wars of the Mongol Empire, where the swords that once conquered the world began turning to slaughter each other. Click on it now to continue the journey of exploring the dramatically hidden corners of history.